It started with a laugh, a smug, neighborly chuckle that echoed through the hedges. "Your grass looks too happy," she sneered. She had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. It was the kind of suburb where silence spoke volumes. A place where fences were white, lawns were trimmed with a ruler, and garbage bins lined the curb like obedient soldiers every Thursday morning. Appearances were everything here, and deviations from the aesthetic norm were quietly punished with long stares, thinly veiled passive aggression, and anonymous HOA notices. No one knew much about the man living in the house on the corner. He was polite but reserved, the type who nodded at block parties but never stayed for the beer. His house, modest but immaculate, sat under the shade of an old maple tree. And his lawn was perfection, lush, vibrant, unnaturally green even during droughts. Each blade of grass seemed to lean in the same direction, swaying gently like a choir under a breeze only it could feel. People whispered about it. Some speculated he used imported fertilizer. Others insisted he was running an underground irrigation system. A few joked that he must be out there talking to the grass at night. Whatever it was, the effect was unsettling, almost surreal, and it made some people uncomfortable, especially Cynthia. Cynthia lived across the street, mid-40s, always in workout gear, but rarely seen sweating. She walked around like the HOA bylaws were her personal scripture. She had a perfect smile and perfect posture and a reputation for managing the community with subtle tyranny. Everyone knew not to cross her. She had gotten more than one neighbor fined for things like mailbox rust or garden gnomes, too whimsical for the block's aesthetic. To her, the man's lawn was a silent threat. It was too perfect, too consistent. It made her own grass look dull in comparison, and she took it personally. She'd joke about it in group texts, in committee meetings, and especially during her morning walks when he was outside watering. "Your grass is looking very happy today," she'd say with a tight smile and slightly narrowed eyes. On the surface, it seemed like playful teasing, but underneath was an accusation. Something unnatural, something manipulative. And he understood it every time. He never reacted. He'd smile softly and nod, but he never rose to the bait. The truth was he had noticed Cynthia long before she noticed him. Not because he was curious, but because he was observant. It was part of who he was. While others chatted and gossiped at the HOA meetings, he watched. He noticed how Cynthia always interrupted at just the right time to take credit for others' ideas, how she steered conversations toward herself, how she could make people feel small without raising her voice. He saw the politics, the power games, and the insecurity buried beneath her polished exterior. She controlled the neighborhood with charm and manipulation, but she wasn't particularly careful. She left traces, paper trails, digital hints, overheard conversations. Most people weren't paying attention, but he was. He saw the complaints she filed against a young couple who painted their shutters blue. He noticed how her own backyard, just out of view from the street, was neglected and full of synthetic turf. He noted the way she always complimented people right before undermining them. Over time, he collected these little details, not because he intended to use them, but because that was how he operated, watching, recording, remembering. But something changed the day she said it, really said it. It was early spring, the grass just waking up from winter. He was out back, adjusting the sprinkler heads, when Cynthia leaned over the low hedge and called out, "You know, your lawn looks too happy. Like it's faking it. Maybe it's time you let it get a little real." It was said with a laugh. A joke. A passive dig, maybe. But it was different. It wasn't just envy anymore. It was a challenge. A nudge. A warning. And when he turned to look at her, he caught something in her eyes. A flicker of something deeper. Discomfort. Suspicion. Maybe even fear. She couldn't understand how someone like him, quiet, introverted, not part of her social games, could maintain something so flawless. It threatened her illusion of control. That day, for the first time, he smiled back differently. Not politely, not passively. There was something calculated in his eyes now. Something measured. He didn't respond with words. He simply nodded and continued adjusting the sprinklers. But that evening, as the sky turned pink and the neighborhood retreated into their homes. He sat in his study, lit only by the glow of his monitor. He opened a folder on his computer labeled Yard, but inside were not pictures of grass or landscaping tips. Inside were screenshots, emails, recordings, documents he had quietly gathered for the past 2 years, notes he'd taken after every HOA meeting, transcripts of Cynthia's offhand remarks, a PDF of a leaked HOA budget showing unexplained expenses. He had never intended to use any of it, but now, for the first time, he felt something stir, not anger but resolve. She had crossed a line, not by insulting his grass, but by attempting to humiliate him in public, by mocking something he cared about as if it made him strange or weak. She was staking her dominance in broad daylight, no less, and he knew it was time to respond. But he wouldn't respond with rage or confrontation. That wasn't his way. No, his revenge would be quiet, surgical, and most importantly, public. For now, he stood by the window and looked at the lawn. It swayed under the moonlight, green and serene, almost as if it knew what was coming. He imagined her watching from her blinds, eyes narrowed, trying to decode his stillness. Let her wonder. The grass wasn't happy. It was patient, and it had just become part of the plan. Before the grass ever grew thick enough to draw attention, there had been a history, a quiet war waged through glances, neighborhood whispers, and a long hedge that served as both boundary and battleground. It wasn't always animosity between them. When he first moved into the neighborhood, she brought over a casserole, smiled too brightly, asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. Where is he from? Did he have family? What did he do for work? Did he have plans to attend the next HOA gathering? At first, it seemed like a neighborly welcome, but beneath her overly rehearsed hospitality, there was a subtle probing. She didn't like unknowns, and he was one. He had answered politely, vaguely, keeping personal details to a minimum. That bothered her. He could tell. People like Cynthia built their power on knowledge, not deep knowledge, but the kind that allowed her to draw lines between people. The more she knew, the more she controlled. He gave her nothing. That was their first unspoken battle. The first real hint of trouble came a few months later, when he received a formal HOA warning about leaving his garbage bin out too long after pickup, an infraction that he found odd, considering he'd pulled it in within minutes that day. The paper was unsigned, the rules cited obscure, but the implication was clear. It was a message, and he had no doubt who had sent it. Cynthia had a presence on the HOA board that extended beyond her official title. Technically, she was just a committee member. In reality, she orchestrated most of its decisions. She rarely voted, preferring to influence. She didn't need authority on paper. She had it in practice, through charisma, manipulation, and a fearsome knack for controlling perception. He began to see the signs everywhere. The older couple down the street who were fined twice in 1 month for a decorative birdhouse. The single mother whose flower beds were deemed non-compliant. Even the retired veteran who'd been warned about the angle of his flagpole. It was all too consistent, too selective. Cynthia had a method. Identify, isolate, correct. She framed it as protecting the neighborhood standard, but it was really about maintaining her image as the unofficial queen of the cul-de-sac. She was smart, though. She never made open enemies. Every action came with plausible deniability. Each notice or warning was buried in paperwork, framed in concern, justified with vague HOA codes. Most neighbors grumbled, but complied. A few moved away. No one ever fought back. But he wasn't most people. He didn't push back either. Not yet. Instead, he started collecting. Not out of vengeance, but curiosity. He was fascinated by her system, the structure she had built, the quiet grip she had on everyone. So he watched. He began attending HOA meetings, never speaking, always observing. He noted how she would steer conversations, how she interrupted gently but firmly, how she whispered to board members between agenda items. She would propose motions through others, praise someone only to undermine them later, and correct others while pretending to compliment them. Her power was invisible unless you knew how to see it. One night, he noticed her linger after a meeting, talking with the HOA treasurer. A few weeks later, a budget report was released with new landscaping allocations. Funds shifted from one neighborhood entrance to another. That second entrance just happened to lead directly past her home. A coincidence, perhaps, but a convenient one. He filed away. On another occasion, he overheard her offering advice to a young family about how to better fit into the community. What she meant, of course, was how to make themselves less visible. Fewer toys in the yard. No loud music. Curtains drawn by dusk. It was inclusion with conditions. Again, he said nothing. Just listened and remembered. He didn't consider himself a crusader. He wasn't trying to expose her. Not at first. But the more he saw, the more he realized how deeply she relied on people's silence. She thrived on the assumption that no one would challenge her, that her charm would protect her, that the web she'd woven was too subtle to unravel. Then came the security camera footage. His own, installed years ago mostly out of habit. It caught her one morning, early, just after sunrise, walking her dog along the sidewalk and pausing briefly at the edge of his property. Nothing overt. She simply leaned over and seemed to inspect the grass. But then she plucked something, a small soil flag, used to mark fertilizer application. She tucked it in her jacket and walked off. Why? What did she think she was doing? Stealing evidence of something? Setting the stage for a complaint? He didn't know, but it didn't matter. The image was enough. The power dynamic had shifted. She had crossed from passive manipulation into active interference. The irony wasn't lost on him. All those years, she had tried to shape him into a problem, an outsider, a curiosity, something suspicious. But now she had become what she feared most, exposed. He started combing through public records, property filings, HOA budgets, anything that could provide context, contradiction, or confirmation. It didn't take long to uncover inconsistencies. Payments from the HOA account to vendors that didn't exist. Committee votes held without quorum. Photos from neighborhood events that had been curated to exclude certain people, always the ones who'd resisted her influence. She had built a legacy on fake perfection, not so different, he realized, from the accusation she'd leveled at his lawn. Too happy. What she really meant was too flawless to be real. But it was real. He had worked for it. She, on the other hand, had crafted an illusion, and now it was beginning to crack. He didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. What he felt was clarity, understanding. All this time, she thought she was subtly dominating him. But the hedge between their properties hadn't just been a physical divider. It had been a veil, and he'd seen through it long ago. Now he had the history. He had the context. And, more importantly, he had the patience. The trap wouldn't be set overnight, but it had already begun, quietly, methodically, like a root system spreading beneath the soil, waiting to bloom. The moment she made that snide remark about his grass being too happy, the gears began to turn. Slowly, silently, without a flicker of visible emotion. He didn't react, not outwardly. That was the beauty of it. People like Cynthia thrived on obvious opposition. They needed resistance to flex against, something to conquer publicly. But he gave her none. He watered his lawn. He smiled. He nodded. And later that evening, he began a plan. The first thing he did was expand his garden, not physically, but in purpose. What once had been a quiet exercise in routine care became a stage. Every movement outside became a performance. Every interaction a subtle chess move. She still passed by during her morning walks, making her comments, feigning casual interest. He responded in kind, dropping hints. Fertilizer brands, watering techniques. Mulch timing is everything, he told her once, casually, like they were old friends swapping tips. She listened, intrigued though guarded. That's when he knew she was biting. He began documenting every exchange. Each offhand remark, every time she paused just a little too long near the edge of his property, all of it was saved. Not because he needed proof yet, but because he knew the time would come when subtle records would become vital. He stored these clips in a folder labeled innocuously as yard log. Then, he began baiting her, not with aggression, but with influence. He knew she couldn't resist the allure of status and attention. So when he accidentally left his screen open one afternoon while she came over to discuss a hedge trimming complaint, she saw a message from a regional gardening association pop up. "Would love to feature your lawn in next month's segment," it read. He watched her read it. Her eyes scanned the screen in a heartbeat, and her mouth twitched into that familiar practice smile. She left with a rehearsed compliment about the lushness of his fescue, but he could see it, envy, and ambition. 3 days later, he submitted her name to the producers of Green Living Local, a regional gardening and lifestyle show that occasionally featured suburban homeowners in their yards. He emailed them anonymously, praising Cynthia as a pillar of the neighborhood, an outspoken voice in community beautification. He included links to her curated social media, which she updated religiously. He knew she'd accept the invitation the moment they reached out. And they did. Cynthia was ecstatic, though she pretended not to be. She talked about it loudly during the next HOA meeting. "They contacted me. Can you believe it?" she said with a chuckle, though everyone in the room could see she'd been rehearsing that line for days. The show would film in 2 weeks, and she invited a few board members to come watch, maybe even appear briefly on camera. He played along. He offered to help get the neighborhood looking sharp for the cameras, suggested pressure washing the sidewalks, tidying the shared flower beds. He even offered some of his own garden tools, which she accepted with a false humility that didn't quite reach her eyes. In the days leading up to the shoot, he focused on fine-tuning the narrative. He knew the producers of Green Living Local would want human interest, stories, conflict, resolution. So he reached out again, anonymously, this time with a story. A quiet feud, he claimed, between two neighbors. One who was meticulous and quiet, the other social and ambitious. He hinted at a scandal. Nothing specific, just enough to hook them. Producers are always hunting for drama. They ask questions. He let them chase. Meanwhile, Cynthia doubled down on her performance. She hired a landscaper for the first time in years, trying to compete with the very lawn she had once mocked. She had new sod laid overnight. It clashed slightly with her older grass, but the difference was subtle, enough to impress people who didn't look too closely. She bought planters, installed fairy lights, posted updates on her story. "TV ready," she joked, her captions punctuated with winks and emojis. To the outside world, she was riding high, but he could see it, the frantic need to stay on top. She was covering cracks with lights and filters. What she didn't know was that he had already tipped the scales. The night before the shoot, he quietly handed over a flash drive to one of the junior producers. "Just a few clips," he said. Context. On it were recordings, Cynthia mocking neighbors, dismissing HOA concerns, even questioning the intelligence of the community in a private Zoom meeting she hadn't realized he had access to. There was no voiceover, no added commentary, just raw footage, the kind that speaks volumes without narration. The producer watched in silence. He didn't press. He didn't ask where it came from. The story was writing itself. On the morning of the shoot, Cynthia was radiant. Camera ready, mic'd up, moving from shot to shot like she'd done this a dozen times. The crew followed her through a freshly spruced-up yard, asking questions about her vision for the community and her dedication to neighborhood unity. She answered everyone with charm and practiced warmth. But the energy shifted as the crew moved next door to his lawn. He hadn't prepared anything flashy. He didn't change a thing. His grass looked as it always did, quietly perfect, and he spoke simply. When asked about the community, he smiled. "I've lived here a few years. It's peaceful. Mostly." A producer caught the pause, the glint in his eye. They pressed further. "Is there tension between you and your neighbor?" He tilted his head slightly. "I think tension's the wrong word. More like misalignment. Different values." That's all he said. And yet it was enough. Later, when they interviewed other residents, a few began to share their own stories, small complaints, interactions with Cynthia that left them feeling uneasy or judged. The pieces began to form a pattern. The producers, sensing the narrative gold beneath the surface, didn't stop rolling. She was still smiling by the end of the day, but it was thinner now, the edges tight. Something had shifted, and she felt it. She noticed the questions becoming more pointed, The producers more curious than celebratory. And though she didn't know it yet, the real footage, the one that would air, wasn't about her garden tips. It was about what bloomed behind her words. The trap hadn't snapped shut yet, but had sprung. And in the quiet hours after the crew packed up and the neighborhood returned to its muted routines, he sat in his study again, watching the footage they had filmed. He didn't smile. That wasn't his way. But the look in his eyes was unmistakable. The stage was set, and now it was only a matter of time. The day the episode aired began like any other, but the air was different, not just for him, but across the whole neighborhood. People had heard. Not everything, but enough. Green Living Local's teaser had been short and sweet. When curb appeal turns into community chaos. This week, we uncover the roots of suburban perfection and what they're really hiding. She must have seen the teaser too, and from the moment the sun came up, she was scrambling to maintain control. Her porch was decorated to the teeth, redone from the week before, potted geraniums, flags, welcome signs. Her Instagram was flooded with polished reels, pulling together every warm, maternal angle she could muster. Grateful to be featured, she wrote. It's all about heart. But by mid-afternoon, the buzz was louder than her filters. People were talking, not just about gardens or grass, but her. Quiet messages passed between neighbors. There was an air of anticipation, like the town had caught wind of something bigger than lawn tips. And then the clock struck 8 p.m. The intro to the episode played with the usual upbeat music and sweeping shots of neighborhood fences, flower beds, and sprinkler systems. Her face appeared first, smiling, beaming, voiceover describing her as a community leader and lawn enthusiast. She looked perfect, composed, in control. But 5 minutes in, things shifted. They showed a series of short, candid interviews with other residents. A woman described how she'd once been told her child's sidewalk chalk disrupted the aesthetic. Another mentioned how their complaint about a leak near a shared pipe had been dismissed, until Cynthia had a similar issue, and suddenly the HOA funded a repair. Then came a quiet, slow zoom on his yard. The music paused. The tone shifted. He was sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of an elm tree, serene. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His voice was calm. She said my grass was too happy, he said, eyes never leaving the camera, as if perfection wasn't earned, as if it was suspicious. The screen cut to the footage. Security camera clips. Her, crouched on his property. Her, mocking a neighbor on Zoom. Her, telling another resident they might want to consider curtains if they didn't want to be gossiped about. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. It was precise, undeniable. The kind of thing that sinks deep because it's not edited to shock, just to reveal. The silence that followed in living rooms across the block was deafening. And then, the final blow. The producer, smart, subtle, asked a simple question in her closing interview. Do you feel the neighborhood is happy with your leadership? She hesitated, a beat too long, then smiled that trained, pageant-perfect smile. I think they appreciate structure. I think people like to feel safe. No cutaway, just a long, lingering look, and the audience could see what he had always seen, the fracture behind the smile. After it aired, the neighborhood changed. She didn't appear for her usual morning walk the next day. Her car stayed parked. No porch photos, no reels, no activity in the HOA group chat. A silence that was more revealing than any confrontation. But what surprised him most wasn't her absence. It was how quickly the veil lifted. Neighbors who once whispered now spoke openly. People knocked on his door, some to apologize for never speaking up, others just to say they saw it too now. One man, who'd lived on the corner for over 10 years and had never spoken more than a greeting, offered him a beer and sat on the curb with him for nearly an hour. Just talking. It was as if the spell Cynthia had cast for years, of curated control and passive intimidation, had broken, and everyone woke up at once. At the next HOA meeting, the turnout was double. For the first time in years, people brought their own notes. Questions. Proposals. Someone suggested rotating committee roles every quarter to avoid unintentional bias. It passed unanimously. Cynthia wasn't there. She sent an email later that week, resigning from her position on the board. No explanation. No dramatic sign-off. Just a polite message about refocusing on family and rest. He read it twice and deleted it. But here's the part that stayed with him. He didn't feel victorious. There was no thrill. No chest-thumping triumph. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that follows when something long-rotting is finally removed. Not with an explosion, but a quiet snap, like the last thread of a web undone. And then, regrowth. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. It never had been, but it was real now. People planted Messier flower beds. Kids' bikes sat in driveways longer. There were more barbecues, more dogs off leash, more laughter in the air at night. The kind of life that grass, even happy grass, grows best in. He kept his lawn just as it was. Meticulous, yes, but never sterile. Every blade, every trimmed edge was still maintained with care, but not for competition. Not anymore. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching something fake unravel while you remain exactly who you've always been. Calm, grounded, and real. Even if your grass is a little too happy. It had been a few weeks since the episode aired, but the ripple effect hadn't stopped. If anything, it had only deepened. What was once a quiet undercurrent of tension had now become a strangely unspoken shift in the social dynamics of the neighborhood. There were no outright accusations, no large-scale arguments or messy confrontations. Instead, there was a soft unraveling, the kind that doesn't need noise to be undeniable. He began to notice the way people carried themselves differently. Conversations that used to halt when Cynthia walked by now continued without pause. That invisible pause, that social flinch, was gone. People were no longer editing themselves. Her presence no longer bent the atmosphere around her. For the first time in years, she was just another resident. And even that status seemed increasingly optional. At first, she tried to save face. She doubled down on visibility, strategically placed community event posters on her porch, another curated Instagram post about how she was taking time offline for mental health, peppered with soft-lit selfies and tea mugs. But the facade no longer landed. No one liked the post. Literally. 0 hearts. 0 comments. She began to keep her distance. Her once frequent strolls around the neighborhood stopped entirely. Her garden, the same one she had renovated so aggressively for the camera crew, was starting to wilt. The flowers faded. The new sod she had rushed to install browned along the edges, revealing the underlying disconnect between presentation and substance. Everything carefully built to show off had been built too quickly, and now that no one was watching, it couldn't maintain itself. He watched all of this unfold without needing to intervene. That was the most satisfying part. The gravity of her undoing was entirely self-sustained. There was no need for confrontation, no need to gloat. She had climbed the ladder of self-importance, and when the bottom rung snapped, she had nowhere to step. But while she faded into the periphery, something else began to grow, something far more interesting. The neighborhood, now free of her performative oversight, found new rhythms. Without her controlling voice in the HOA meetings, people began to speak with surprising openness. A man who had never raised his hand before brought up the idea of starting a communal vegetable patch. A single mother volunteered to start a weekend book club for local teens. Even those who had been largely silent, introverts, immigrants, retirees, began offering stories, suggestions, small acts of investment. People began lingering on porches again. Actual porches. Not the one stage for Pinterest, but the ones with chipped paint and old chairs. They lingered, talked, shared. There were arguments, yes, real ones, over fences and pets and parking. But they weren't about control. They were about living. And in the middle of all this, his lawn remained the same. Somehow, that detail mattered most. He didn't change a thing, didn't start a garden blog, didn't go on another show, didn't even speak about Cynthia publicly. His silence became its own kind of power. The lawn, which had once been a quiet target of her insecurity, now became a symbol, not of perfection, but of authenticity. Consistency. It hadn't been a competition. It had just been his. And in a world where so many tried to make everything performative, that quiet authenticity had outlived the loudest voice. Then came a strange part. One afternoon, he received a letter. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't sealed in anything fancy. Just a plain envelope tucked under the edge of his doormat. No name, no return address. Just a few lines on a piece of stationery that looked like it had been taken from an old wedding planner notebook. I didn't mean for it to turn into that. I was angry, and then I was embarrassed. I thought if I could control the narrative, I could control the outcome. But I didn't expect you to be the one who understood the power of waiting. You let the truth speak for itself. I think that's what hurt the most. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to say it anyway, for what it's worth. See, he read it twice, then once more. It didn't offer closure, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't an apology filled with promises or dramatic emotion. It was small, quiet, almost sad, but it felt honest, perhaps the first truly honest thing she'd given him. He didn't respond. He didn't mention it to anyone, but he didn't throw it away either. He folded it back into the envelope and placed it in the back of an old notebook he kept on a shelf by the window. Somewhere safe, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder that even the loudest, most controlling people are still human under all their armor. And sometimes that armor breaks under the weight of its own sharp edges. Weeks passed, then months. Cynthia eventually sold her house. Quietly, without fanfare. A small for sale by owner sign appeared one day, and by the end of the season, a moving truck backed into her driveway at dawn. By midday, she was gone. No one asked where she went. No one needed to. And when the new family moved in, a young couple with a baby and a golden retriever who immediately tore up half the flower beds, no one complained. People brought cookies, introduced themselves, offered to help with the fence. He stood across the street, watering his lawn, watching it all unfold. He didn't step forward. He didn't insert himself. He just nodded when the couple waved, offered a smile when the baby babbled over the dog's barking. He understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. Neighborhoods aren't built from rules. They're built from rhythm, from breathing space, from messiness, laughter, awkward introductions, burned barbecue, overgrown weeds, chalk drawings, shared silence, and small kindnesses. And yes, maybe even from a little bit of happy grass. The seasons rolled forward, and with them, the small changes that only become visible in hindsight. By the time autumn had fully set in, the neighborhood had transformed, but not in any loud or dramatic way. It was subtle, a soft rebalancing. The edges were looser. The interactions were warmer. A feeling hung in the air, one that hadn't been present for years. Ease. He noticed it in the way people walked now, not brisk and self-conscious, but casual, like they finally belonged on their own sidewalks. He noticed it in the way porch lights flickered on not out of necessity, but out of welcome. Front yards that had once been tense battlegrounds of competition were now alive with variance. Some lawns were still pristine, edged and green. Others were messy, filled with native plants, bird feeders, even small hand-painted signs from kids. No one complained. No one tried to outdo the other. Every home began to look like its people. Imperfect, expressive, real. And yet, amid this quiet revival, he remained the same. Or at least, mostly, he still trimmed his lawn every Thursday morning, still swept the driveway with care. But something in his expression had softened. The lines around his eyes seemed less guarded, the tension in his shoulders no longer fixed. Where once he moved through the neighborhood as a quiet observer, now he was part of the rhythm. Not the center, never the center, but a trusted constant. People looked to him differently now, not with suspicion or envy, but with respect. Some even with quiet gratitude. He found himself part of conversations he used to avoid. Invitations to block parties, offers to co-chair small local projects, even a monthly dinner hosted by one of the newer couples down the street. He didn't always say yes. In fact, he still enjoyed his solitude more than most. But when he did show up, people noticed, and they appreciated it. Not because he was some kind of hero, but because he had become something rare, a person who stood quietly on principle and let time do the talking. What lingered most, though, wasn't the fall of Cynthia or the victory of being proven right. or even the reforming of the community. It was the clarity, the long, slow realization that the real story had never been about grass or lawns or neighborhood feuds. It had been about truth, how it hides, how it reveals, and how, when left to its own devices, it always finds the light. He would think about that sometimes as he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in the morning, watching the golden light stretch across the rooftops. The world felt different in those quiet hours. Truer. The noise of social media, of gossip, of performance faded in the early stillness. There was just dew, breath, and the occasional flutter of bird wings. It was during one of these mornings, maybe a year after the incident, that he noticed the note again, the one she had left him. It was tucked between the pages of his old notebook, mostly forgotten. He hadn't read it in months. When he unfolded it, the paper was slightly creased, but the words hadn't changed. There was no regret in rereading it, only understanding. He still didn't forgive her, not because he held a grudge, but because forgiveness wasn't the point. She had burned bridges in her own heart long before she tried to control his. And maybe that was punishment enough, knowing that the legacy she worked so hard to craft had collapsed under the weight of her own delusions, and that the man she tried to belittle never had to raise his voice to undo her. He placed the note back in the book, closed it gently, and slid it onto the shelf. He didn't feel the need to revisit it again. By winter, the neighborhood felt settled in a new way. A few new families moved in, bringing children, energy, music. Snowmen appeared in mismatched sizes on different lawns. Decorations varied wildly. Some houses went all out, others barely lit a single string. No one judged. No one coordinated. And for the first time in years, the lack of uniformity felt not chaotic but comforting. He was asked to give a short speech at the annual winter gathering, an informal tradition that had, until recently, always been handled by Cynthia. He hesitated at first. Speeches weren't his thing, but something in the way his neighbors asked, not out of pressure, but genuine interest, made him reconsider. When the time came, he didn't speak long. He stepped up in his usual quiet way, looked out at the bundled-up faces around him, and simply said, "I think we all figured something out this year, about how to live next to each other, not on top of each other. I've seen more smiles in the last 6 months than in the last 6 years. And I think maybe we were never missing structure. We were just missing grace. Thanks for bringing it back." That was it. People clapped, not wildly but warmly, the kind of applause that doesn't fade quickly. Later that night, a small group lingered near the bonfire, swapping stories. One of the new residents asked him how he kept his lawn so green. He chuckled, shook his head. Lots of patience, and a little bit of ignoring the noise. They laughed, not knowing the depth behind the words. But he did, and in that quiet knowing, he felt something final settle inside him. Not triumph, not pride, peace. Because sometimes the real ending isn't when the villain falls. It's when the silence after becomes a place to grow something better. And in the stillness, the grass, still vibrant, still happy, swayed gently in the wind.